The morning sun cast long shadows across Thomas Wright's wheat fields as he walked the familiar path he had traveled every day for 37 years. His weathered hands gripped the worn wooden handle of his walking stick, a tool that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. The autumn harvest was nearly complete, and the golden stalks swayed gently in the cool breeze that carried the promise of winter. Thomas had inherited these 300 acres of farmland in rural Montana from his family, continuing a tradition that stretched back 4 generations. At 58 years old, he lived alone since his wife Margaret had passed 5 years ago, finding solace in the rhythms of farming and the companionship of his animals. His nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away, and he preferred the solitude that allowed him to work the land in peace. As he approached the old red barn that housed his livestock, something caught his attention near the edge of his property where the wheat field met the dense pine forest. A strange shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt, flickered between the trees. Thomas squinted against the morning light, thinking his aging eyes were playing tricks on him. Then he heard it, a sound unlike anything he had ever encountered, somewhere between a bird's chirp and a cat's mew, but with an otherworldly quality that made the hair on his arm stand up. The sound came again, weaker this time, filled with what could only be described as distress. Thomas made his way toward the forest edge, pushing through the tall grass that grew wild at the boundary of his cultivated land. The strange shimmer became more pronounced as he approached, and he realized he was looking at something that defied explanation. What appeared to be a metallic craft, no larger than a small car, lay partially embedded in the soft earth. Its surface was smooth and reflected the morning light in ways that seemed almost liquid. The craft had clearly crashed, leaving a shallow furrow in the ground that extended back into the trees. Broken branches and scattered pine needles marked its path, suggesting it had come to rest here after a violent impact. Steam or some other vapor rose from various points along its hull, and strange symbols glowed faintly along what might have been access panels. The distressed sound came again, definitely emanating from within the craft. Thomas approached cautiously, his farmer's instincts warring between curiosity and prudence. He had seen his share of strange things during his years working the land, from unusual weather phenomena to animals behaving oddly, but nothing had prepared him for this. As he circled the craft, looking for any obvious way inside, a section of the hull suddenly iris open with a soft hissing sound. The opening was perfectly circular, about 3 feet in diameter, and from within came a pale blue light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The crying sound intensified, and now Thomas could hear something else, a rhythmic tapping as if something small was moving around inside the craft. His paternal instincts, dormant since he and Margaret had never been blessed with children, suddenly awakened. Something inside that craft was alive, scared, and possibly hurt. "Hello," Thomas called softly, feeling somewhat foolish for speaking to what was obviously some kind of alien technology. "Is someone in there?" The movement inside stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was complete silence except for the wind rustling through the pine trees. Then, slowly, a small head emerged from the opening. Thomas had to blink several times to make sure he was seeing correctly. The creature that peered out at him was unlike anything from Earth, yet strangely familiar. It was roughly the size of a house cat, with an elongated neck and head that reminded him of pictures he had seen of baby dinosaurs. Its skin appeared to be covered in tiny scales that shifted color from deep blue to purple as it moved, and its large eyes, easily twice the size they should be for its head, regarded him with an intelligence that was unmistakably sentient. Most striking of all were the small wing-like appendages folded against its back. They were translucent and delicate, like a dragonfly's wings but stronger looking, and they trembled slightly as the creature observed him. The baby dragon, for that was the only word Thomas could think of to describe it, made the mewing sound again. This time, however, it was clearly directed at him, and the tone was different, less distressed, more curious, and perhaps hopeful. "Well, I'll be damned," Thomas whispered under his breath. He crouched down slowly, making himself appear smaller and less threatening. "You're just a little one, aren't you?" The creature tilted its head at the sound of his voice, and Thomas noticed that its movements were unsteady. One of its front legs appeared to be favoring the other, and there was a small cut visible on its flank where the scales had been scraped away. "You're hurt, little fella," Thomas said gently, extending his hand slowly with his palm up. "And I bet you're scared too. That was quite a crash landing you had there." The baby dragon sniffed the air delicately, its nostrils flaring. Thomas remained perfectly still, letting the creature get used to his scent. After what felt like several minutes, the dragon took a tentative step forward, then another. When it reached the edge of the craft's opening, it hesitated, looking back inside as if checking for something. Another sound came from within the craft, this one mechanical and ominous. A series of clicks followed by a low humming that was definitely not biological. The baby dragon looked back at Thomas with what he could only interpret as urgency, then let out a series of rapid chirping sounds. "I don't understand what you're saying, little one," Thomas admitted, "but I can tell something's wrong in there." As if in response to his words, the humming from inside the craft grew louder and took on an irregular rhythm. Sparks began to flicker from the opening, and the pale blue light inside started to strobe erratically. The baby dragon made its decision. With obvious effort, it launched itself from the craft toward Thomas, its injured leg causing it to land awkwardly in the grass. It immediately tried to scramble away from the craft, dragging its hurt leg and making sounds of pain. Thomas didn't hesitate. He scooped up the small creature, surprised by how light it was despite its apparent solidity. Its scales felt warm against his hands, like smooth stones that had been sitting in sunlight. The dragon tensed in his arms for a moment, then seemed to recognize that he meant no harm and relaxed slightly. "There we go," Thomas murmured, cradling the creature against his chest. "Let's get you away from that thing." No sooner had he taken several steps back than the craft made a sound like a massive electrical short circuit. The strobing light inside flashed once, brilliantly, then went dark. The humming stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence. The baby dragon in Thomas's arms made a soft, mournful sound and looked back at the now silent craft. Thomas understood instinctively that whatever had brought this little creature to his farm, it wasn't coming back. The dragon was stranded here, injured and alone. "Come on, little one," Thomas said, adjusting his hold to make the creature more comfortable. "Let's get you back to the house. I've got some experience patching up hurt animals, and you look like you could use a good meal." As he walked back across his fields toward the farmhouse, Thomas felt the baby dragon's heartbeat against his chest. It was rapid but strong, and gradually it began to slow as they moved further from the crash site. The creature's large eyes darted around, taking in everything they passed with obvious intelligence and curiosity. Thomas found himself talking to the dragon as they walked, the same way he had always talked to his animals. "That's my wheat field there, just finished bringing in the harvest last week. Those are my chickens over there in the coop, though I suppose you can see that. And that old barn has been in my family for over a century." The dragon listened to his voice, occasionally making small chirping sounds that almost seemed like responses. By the time they reached the farmhouse, Thomas was beginning to feel like he was carrying on an actual conversation, even though he couldn't understand a word the creature was saying. The farmhouse itself was a simple two-story structure built from local stone and timber. Margaret had always kept a garden along the south side, and though Thomas maintained it as best he could, it lacked the loving touch she had provided. The wraparound porch offered a view of the entire farm, from the wheat fields to the pastures where his small herd of cattle grazed. As Thomas climbed the porch steps, the baby dragon seemed to relax further. Perhaps it sensed that this was a safe place, or perhaps it was simply exhausted from its ordeal. Either way, it settled more comfortably in his arms and made a sound that was almost like a purr. "Well now," Thomas said as he reached for the screen door handle, "let's see what we can do about getting you fixed up and fed. Something tells me this is going to be the start of something neither of us could have imagined." The baby dragon looked up at him with those impossibly large eyes, and Thomas could swear he saw understanding there, along with something that might have been gratitude. As he carried his unexpected guest into the farmhouse, Thomas Wright had no idea that his simple act of kindness was about to change not only his life, but potentially the course of two entire species' relationship with one another. Thomas carried the baby dragon into his kitchen, a spacious room that had served as the heart of the Wright family home for 4 generations. The walls were lined with handmade cabinets that his grandfather had crafted, and herbs from Margaret's garden still hung in dried bundles from the exposed wooden beams. Sunlight streamed through gingham curtains, casting warm patterns across the worn wooden table where Thomas had eaten countless meals. He gently set the dragon down on an old quilted blanket that Margaret had made years ago, spreading it across the kitchen table to create a soft nest. The creature immediately curled up, its injured leg tucked beneath its body, but its large eyes remained alert and focused on Thomas's every movement. "First things first," Thomas said, washing his hands at the old porcelain sink. "Let's take a look at that leg of yours." The dragon watched him approach with obvious wariness, but didn't try to flee when Thomas gently extended his hands toward the injured limb. Years of caring for injured farm animals had taught him to move slowly and speak in calm, reassuring tones. "Easy there, little one," he murmured as he carefully examined the dragon's front leg. "I just want to help." The injury appeared to be a sprain rather than a break, though there was some swelling and a small cut where the scales had been scraped away. The dragon winced when Thomas gently probed the area, but it didn't try to bite or scratch him. Instead, it made a soft trilling sound that somehow conveyed both pain and trust. Thomas retrieved his first aid kit from the pantry, the same kit he used for treating his animals. He cleaned the small wound with antiseptic, noting how the dragon's scales seemed to shift color slightly in response to his touch, deepening from blue to a rich purple around the injured area. "That's interesting," Thomas said, more to himself than to the dragon. "Do you change color when you're hurt, or is that just how you react to new situations?" The dragon tilted its head at the sound of his voice and made a series of musical chirping sounds. The scales gradually returned to their original blue color, and Thomas took that as a positive sign. He fashioned a small splint from a wooden stirring spoon and some gauze, wrapping the dragon's leg carefully to provide support without restricting movement too much. The creature submitted to this treatment with remarkable patience, occasionally making soft sounds that Thomas interpreted as communication attempts. "There," Thomas said when he finished. "That should help it heal properly. Now I bet you're hungry after all that excitement." At the word hungry, or perhaps just at the tone of his voice, the dragon perked up noticeably. Its head lifted and it looked around the kitchen with obvious interest, nostrils flaring as it took in the various scents. Thomas opened his refrigerator and surveyed its contents, suddenly realizing he had no idea what a baby dragon might eat. His practical farmer's mind kicked in, and he decided to try a variety of options to see what appealed to his unexpected guest. He started with small pieces of cooked chicken, thinking that as a carnivorous-looking creature, the dragon might prefer meat. He placed a few small morsels on a saucer and set it near the dragon's makeshift nest. The dragon sniffed the chicken delicately, then took a tentative bite. It chewed thoughtfully for a moment, swallowed, then looked up at Thomas with what could only be described as a polite but unimpressed expression. "Not quite right, huh?" Thomas chuckled. "Let me try something else." He tried fresh vegetables next, cutting up small pieces of carrot, celery, and lettuce. The dragon showed more interest in these, particularly the carrots, but still didn't seem particularly enthusiastic. Thomas was beginning to worry that he wouldn't be able to find anything the creature could or would eat when he remembered the fresh milk from his cow, Bessie. He had always been proud of the rich, creamy milk his small herd produced, and something about the dragon's delicate features made him think it might prefer something gentler than meat. He warmed a small amount of milk in a saucepan, adding a touch of honey from his own beehives. The sweet aroma filled the kitchen, and the dragon's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Its head snapped up, eyes wide with interest, and it made an excited chirping sound that was clearly positive. Thomas poured the warm, honeyed milk into a shallow bowl and placed it within easy reach of the dragon. The creature didn't hesitate this time. It lowered its head and began to drink, making soft, humming sounds of contentment as it did so. "Now we're getting somewhere," Thomas said with satisfaction. He watched as the dragon finished the entire bowl, then looked up at him with an expression that somehow managed to convey both gratitude and a request for more. Thomas prepared a second bowl, this time adding even more honey. The dragon drank this one more slowly, savoring each sip. When it finished, it carefully cleaned its face with tiny, dexterous paws that Thomas hadn't noticed before, then curled up on the quilt with a satisfied sigh. "Feeling better?" Thomas asked, settling into a chair beside the table. The dragon looked up at him and made a soft purring sound, its eyelids beginning to droop. As the creature dozed, Thomas found himself studying it more carefully. Now that it was clean and fed, he could see that its scales had an almost opalescent quality, shifting subtly between blue and purple and occasionally showing hints of silver and green. The wing-like appendages on its back were indeed wings, he realized, though they were clearly too small to support flight at the dragon's current size. The dragon's breathing was deep and regular, and Thomas could see that it was beginning to heal already. The swelling in its injured leg had gone down noticeably, and the cut on its flank appeared to be closing. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas went about his usual farm chores, but he found himself checking on the dragon every few minutes. Each time he returned to the kitchen, the creature would open its eyes and make a soft, greeting sound, as if acknowledging his presence. By evening, the dragon was moving around more freely. It had discovered that it could climb down from the table using the chair as a stepping stone, and Thomas found it exploring the kitchen with obvious curiosity. It seemed particularly fascinated by the hanging herbs, stretching up on its hind legs to sniff at them delicately. "Careful there," Thomas warned gently when the dragon showed interest in climbing up to investigate the dried plants more closely. "Some of those might not agree with you." The dragon looked at him as if it understood the warning, then settled back on its haunches and continued its investigation from ground level. That evening, as Thomas prepared his own simple dinner of stew and cornbread, he found himself cooking for two. He warmed more milk with honey for the dragon, and was delighted when the creature showed interest in small pieces of the cornbread soaked in the sweet mixture. They ate together at the kitchen table, Thomas in his usual chair and the dragon perched on the quilt-covered surface. The creature watched him eat with obvious interest, occasionally mimicking his movements in a way that made Thomas chuckle. "You're a quick learner, aren't you?" he observed. The dragon chirped in response and took another delicate sip of its milk. As darkness fell outside, Thomas faced a dilemma he hadn't considered. Where should the dragon sleep? It seemed too small and vulnerable to leave on its own downstairs, but he wasn't sure how it would react to being moved. The decision was made for him when the dragon, apparently sensing his uncertainty, climbed down from the table and began following him around the house as he completed his evening routine. When Thomas went upstairs to his bedroom, the dragon carefully navigated the steps, using both its good leg and the splinted one with growing confidence. In the bedroom, the dragon looked around with interest, then settled itself on the rug beside Thomas's bed. It curled up into a tight ball, tucked its head under one wing, and made a soft trilling sound that Thomas interpreted as a good-night message. "Good night to you too, little one," Thomas said softly as he prepared for bed. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do next." But as he lay in the darkness, listening to the dragon's quiet breathing, Thomas found himself hoping that what to do next would involve the dragon staying. In just one day, the small creature had brought something to his life that he hadn't realized was missing. The farmhouse felt less empty, less lonely, with this unexpected companion sharing his space. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, pattering against the windows in a rhythm that seemed to lull both man and dragon into peaceful sleep. Neither of them knew that this was just the beginning of an extraordinary relationship that would challenge everything humans thought they knew about intelligence, compassion, and the bonds that could form between species separated by millions of years of evolution. The dragon's scales shimmered faintly in the darkness, shifting through subtle colors as it dreamed, and Thomas Wright slept more soundly than he had in months, comforted by the presence of his new friend. 3 weeks had passed since Thomas found the baby dragon, and the creature had become an integral part of daily life on the farm. The dragon, whom Thomas had started calling Ember due to the way its scales sometimes glowed with an inner light when it was happy, had healed remarkably quickly from its initial injuries. The splint had been removed after just a week, and now there was barely any sign that the leg had ever been hurt. What amazed Thomas most was how intelligent Ember proved to be. The dragon learned routines with astonishing speed and seemed to understand not just the tone of Thomas's voice, but increasingly the actual meaning of his words. When Thomas said breakfast, Ember would immediately head to the kitchen. When he mentioned going outside to check on the animals, Ember would position itself by the door, wings quivering with anticipation. The dragon had grown noticeably in the 3 weeks since its arrival. Where it had once been the size of a house cat, Ember was now closer to the size of a medium dog, though its build remained delicate and graceful. Its wings had developed significantly, gaining strength and size, though they still weren't large enough for true flight. Ember could manage short gliding jumps from the barn loft to the ground, landing with increasing grace and confidence. Thomas had established a routine that accommodated his new companion. Each morning, Ember would wake him by gently nuzzling his hand with its warm snout, making soft, trilling sounds that Thomas had learned meant good morning in dragon language. They would go downstairs together, where Thomas would prepare breakfast for both of them. Ember's diet had evolved as the dragon grew. While the honeyed milk remained a favorite, the creature had developed a taste for fresh eggs, sweet corn, and especially the apples from Thomas's small orchard. What surprised Thomas most was discovering that Ember was primarily vegetarian, showing little interest in meat beyond the occasional small fish from the stream that ran through his property. This morning was different from their usual routine, however. As Thomas prepared Ember's breakfast, he noticed the dragon seemed restless and distracted. Instead of its usual enthusiastic approach to mealtime, Ember picked at its food and spent most of the time looking out the window toward the sky. "What's got you so worked up this morning?" Thomas asked, following Ember's gaze. The sky was clear and blue, with no sign of storms or anything else that might be causing concern. Ember made a series of complex chirping and trilling sounds, accompanied by gestures with its wings that Thomas had never seen before. The dragon's scales were shifting colors rapidly, cycling through blues, purples, and silvers in patterns that seemed almost like a language in themselves. Thomas was about to ask another question when he heard it, a sound so faint that at first he thought he might be imagining it. It was similar to the humming he had heard from Ember's crashed ship, but this was coming from the sky above. Ember's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The dragon leaped onto the kitchen table, then scrambled to the window, pressing its face against the glass and making urgent sounds. Its wings spread wide, displaying patterns of color that Thomas had never seen before, intricate designs that seemed to pulse and shift with meaning. Thomas joined Ember at the window and looked up. High above, almost invisible against the morning sky, was what appeared to be another craft. This one was larger than the ship Ember had arrived in, and it moved with purpose rather than the erratic path that suggested a crash landing. "Are those your people?" Thomas asked quietly. Ember looked up at him with those large, expressive eyes and made a sound that was unmistakably affirmative. Then the dragon did something it had never done before. It pressed against Thomas's side in what could only be described as a hug, making soft, mournful sounds. Thomas understood immediately. Ember was being given a choice, and the dragon was conflicted. It wanted to reunite with its own kind, but it had formed a bond with Thomas that it didn't want to break. "It's okay," Thomas said gently, stroking the dragon's smooth scales. "They're your family, you should go to them." But even as he said the words, Thomas felt his heart breaking. Over the past 3 weeks, Ember had become more than just a companion. The dragon had brought joy and purpose back into his life in a way he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. The farmhouse would feel impossibly empty without Ember's cheerful morning greetings and curious explorations. Ember made an urgent chirping sound and tugged at Thomas's sleeve with its small claws, then headed toward the door. Thomas followed, understanding that the dragon wanted him to come outside. In the yard, the approaching craft was more visible. It descended slowly, majestically, revealing itself to be a beautiful vessel that seemed to be made of the same material as Ember's original ship, but crafted with far more sophistication. Its hull was covered in intricate patterns that shifted and flowed like liquid metal, and it moved without any visible means of propulsion. As it landed in the pasture beyond the barn, Thomas could see that it was enormous compared to the small escape pod Ember had arrived in. The craft settled onto the grass with barely a sound, its landing so gentle that it didn't even flatten the wildflowers growing there. Ember was practically vibrating with excitement, but it stayed close to Thomas's side. Its scales were now displaying the most complex color patterns Thomas had ever seen, cycling through what looked like elaborate messages or greetings. A section of the larger craft's hull opened with the same iris-like motion Thomas had observed from Ember's ship, but this opening was much larger. What emerged was not what Thomas had expected. The adult dragon was magnificent. Standing nearly 10 feet tall, with a wingspan that must have been at least 20 feet, it was clearly the same species as Ember, but fully mature. Its scales shimmered with colors that seemed to contain their own light, and intricate patterns covered its wings and neck in designs that spoke of high intelligence and sophisticated culture. But what struck Thomas most was the dragon's posture and movements. There was no aggression, no hostility. Instead, the magnificent creature approached slowly, its head held in a position that Thomas somehow knew was respectful and non-threatening. Ember made a complex series of sounds, its small body nearly glowing with excitement. The adult dragon responded with deep, musical tones that seemed to resonate in Thomas's chest. The conversation between them was clearly complex and nuanced, far beyond simple animal communication. As they talked, more dragons emerged from the ship. Thomas counted at least 6 adults, each unique in their coloring and pattern, but all moving with the same graceful intelligence. One of them, slightly smaller than the first, approached Ember with obvious affection, and Thomas realized he was probably looking at Ember's parent. The reunion was touching to witness. Ember practically threw itself into the adult dragon's embrace, making sounds of pure joy. The larger dragon wrapped Ember gently in its wings, and both creatures' scales pulsed with synchronized patterns of light and color. Thomas felt like an intruder on this private moment, but when he tried to step back discreetly, the first dragon, who seemed to be some kind of leader, turned its attention to him. Those large, intelligent eyes studied him with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. Then the dragon did something extraordinary. It lowered its great head in what was unmistakably a bow, making sounds that, while alien, conveyed deep gratitude. The other dragons followed suit, each bowing to Thomas in turn. Thomas stood speechless for a moment, then remembered his manners. He removed his hat and bowed in return, hopping he was following the appropriate protocol for greeting alien royalty. The leader dragon made more complex sounds, and Ember suddenly detached itself from its parent and scampered back to Thomas's side. The young dragon pressed against his leg, then looked up at him with an expression that was clearly asking a question. "I don't understand," Thomas said helplessly. "I wish I could, but I don't know what you're asking." Ember made frustrated sounds, then suddenly had an idea. The young dragon ran to where Thomas kept his farming tools and returned with a stick. Using its claws and mouth, Ember began drawing in the dirt of the farmyard. What emerged was crude but clearly recognizable. A simple drawing of the farmhouse, the barn, and stick figures representing Thomas and Ember. The young dragon then drew lines connecting the two figures and made questioning sounds. Thomas's eyes widened as he understood. "You want to know if you can stay." Ember chirped excitedly and nodded its head vigorously, then looked toward its parent and made more complex sounds. The adult dragons began what was clearly a discussion, their voices rising and falling in patterns that suggested debate or negotiation. During this conversation, Thomas noticed something remarkable happening. The patterns on the dragon's scales weren't random color changes, they were a form of visual language. Complex thoughts and emotions were being communicated through shifting hues and flowing designs that were as sophisticated as any written language Thomas had ever seen. Finally, the leader dragon approached Thomas again. This time, it extended one of its large, clawed hands toward him, palm up. Thomas hesitated for only a moment before placing his own hand in the dragon's grasp. The moment their skin made contact, Thomas felt a strange, tingling sensation, as if a mild electric current was passing between them. Suddenly, impossibly, he could understand what the dragon was trying to communicate. Not words exactly, but concepts and emotions that formed themselves into meaning in his mind. Gratitude so deep it brought tears to his eyes, respect for his kindness to their young, wonder at the bond that had formed between two such different species, and most importantly, a question: would he be willing to accept the responsibility of continuing to care for their child, knowing that it would mean becoming part of something much larger than himself? Thomas looked down at Ember, who was watching him with hopeful eyes, then back at the magnificent adult dragon whose hand still held his. He thought of the past 3 weeks, the joy and companionship Ember had brought to his life, and the empty years that stretched ahead without the young dragon's presence. "Yes," he said simply, "I'll take care of Ember for as long as you'll let me." The response from the dragons was immediate and overwhelming. Their scales erupted in brilliant displays of color and light, and their voices rose in what could only be described as celebration. Ember launched itself at Thomas, climbing up to perch on his shoulder and nuzzling his cheek affectionately. But as Thomas basked in the warmth of acceptance from these incredible beings, he had no idea that his simple agreement had just changed the course of galactic history. The months following the dragon family's visit transformed Thomas's quiet farm into something resembling an interstellar embassy. The adult dragons, who belonged to a species called the Draconis stellaris, had not simply left Ember in Thomas's care and departed. Instead, they had established what they called a cultural exchange protocol. which meant that representatives of their species would visit regularly to monitor Ember's development and to learn about human civilization. Thomas learned that Ember wasn't just any dragon youngster, but actually the offspring of Zephyros, the expedition leader who had first made contact with him. The Draconis Stellaris were an ancient spacefaring race who had been exploring the galaxy for thousands of years, but they had never encountered a species quite like humans. Dr. Sarah Chen, an exobiologist from the nearby university, had become involved when Thomas finally decided he needed scientific help understanding his new reality. She was initially skeptical when Thomas contacted her with claims of housing an alien dragon, but one look at Ember had convinced her that she was dealing with something unprecedented. "This is remarkable, Thomas," Dr. Chen said during one of her weekly visits, carefully taking measurements of Ember's growing wings. "Ember's physiological development is accelerating at a rate that shouldn't be possible according to our understanding of biology." Ember, now nearly 3 times its original size and sporting wings that were beginning to look capable of actual flight, submitted patiently to Dr. Chen's examinations. The young dragon had learned to tolerate the scientific interest its presence generated, though it clearly preferred spending time with Thomas over being poked and prodded by researchers. What fascinated Dr. Chen most was the evidence of Ember's rapidly developing intelligence. The dragon had not only learned to understand English with remarkable speed, but had also begun to demonstrate problem-solving abilities that surpassed many adult humans. Just that morning, Thomas had discovered Ember in the barn, having apparently figured out how to operate the automated feeding system for the cattle. The dragon had been methodically dispensing the perfect amount of feed for each animal, adjusting portions based on what appeared to be its own assessment of each cow's individual needs. "How did you know to give Bessie extra?" Thomas had asked, referring to his oldest cow who was approaching the end of her productive years. "She does need more nutrition than the others." Ember had made complex chirping sounds and gestured with its wings in patterns that Thomas was beginning to recognize as explanations. While he couldn't understand the specific words, the meaning was clear. Ember could somehow sense the animal's health and nutritional needs in ways that went far beyond normal observation. Dr. Chen was documenting everything, but even she was struggling to keep up with the implications of what they were witnessing. "Thomas, I think we need to consider the possibility that Ember isn't just intelligent in the way we understand intelligence. The dragon species may have capabilities that we can't even properly categorize yet." The proof of this came the following week when Zephyros returned for one of the scheduled visits. The great dragon landed in the pasture with its usual grace, but this time it was accompanied by something Thomas hadn't seen before, a device that looked like a crystalline tree, all flowing curves and surfaces that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. Ember's reaction to seeing this device was immediate and intense. The young dragon's scales erupted in complex patterns of light and color, and it made sounds that conveyed unmistakable excitement and longing. Through their touch-based communication method, Zephyros explained to Thomas that the device was called a knowledge resonator, a tool used by their species to share memories, experiences, and accumulated wisdom. It was typically introduced to young dragons when they reached a certain stage of development, allowing them to access the collective knowledge of their people. "Ember has reached that stage much faster than we anticipated," Zephyros conveyed, the concepts flowing directly into Thomas's mind when they touched hands. "Your care and the stimulation of this environment has accelerated the development beyond our normal expectations. We believe it is time for the next phase of learning." Thomas felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. What does that mean exactly? The answer was both wonderful and terrifying. Ember would be given access to the knowledge resonator, but this would fundamentally change the young dragon. Access to the collective knowledge of an ancient spacefaring civilization would transform Ember from a curious youngster into something approaching a scholar and diplomat. "Will Ember still be Ember?" Thomas asked, voicing his deepest fear. Zephyros's response carried warmth and reassurance. "The essential nature of our young does not change with knowledge, Thomas, right? Ember will always be the being you have nurtured and loved. But that being will become capable of bridging the gap between our species in ways we never thought possible." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Thomas could have imagined. Ember approached the knowledge resonator with obvious reverence, while the adult dragons formed a circle around the device. Their scales synchronized into patterns that pulsed with the rhythm of a shared heartbeat, and the crystalline structure began to emit a low, musical humming. When Ember touched the device with one delicate claw, the effect was immediate and dramatic. Light flowed from the crystal into the young dragon's body, following the pathways of its nervous system and making its scales glow from within. Ember's eyes, already large and expressive, seemed to deepen with understanding as knowledge flowed into its mind. The process lasted for several hours, during which Thomas found himself holding his breath, afraid that the dragon he had grown to love would emerge as a stranger. Dr. Chen took continuous readings with her instruments, documenting energy patterns that defied conventional understanding of how information could be transferred. When it was over, Ember approached Thomas slowly, and for a moment the farmer's heart clenched with the fear that everything had changed. Then the dragon nuzzled against his hand in the same affectionate gesture it had used since its first day on the farm, and Thomas knew that his friend was still there, just enhanced rather than replaced. But the changes became apparent almost immediately. When Dr. Chen began asking her usual questions about Ember's responses to various stimuli, the dragon did something unprecedented. It walked over to her tablet computer and, using one careful claw, began to type. "I understand your questions, Dr. Chen," appeared on the screen in perfectly formed English. "I am happy to participate in your research, but I think you will find that I can now provide much more detailed information than before." Dr. Chen dropped her stylus, staring at the tablet in shock. Thomas felt his knees go weak and had to sit down heavily on a nearby hay bale. "Ember," he managed to say. The dragon turned to him with eyes that now clearly held the depth of centuries of accumulated knowledge, but also the same warmth and affection that had been there since day one. "I am still Ember, Thomas. I am still your friend, but now I am also something more." Over the following days, it became clear just how much more Ember had become. The young dragon could now communicate fluently in any human language, understood concepts ranging from quantum physics to agricultural science, and displayed a grasp of interstellar politics and trade that would have impressed professional diplomats. But perhaps most remarkably, Ember used this new knowledge not to separate itself from Thomas and the farm, but to find ways to improve and enhance the life they had built together. "I have been thinking about your soil composition," Ember said one morning as they walked through the wheat fields together. The dragon had learned to modulate its voice to maintain the musical quality that Thomas found soothing, even when speaking in English. "According to the agricultural databases I now have access to, there are several mineral supplements from my people's worlds that could increase your crop yields by 30% while simultaneously improving soil health." Thomas paused in his walking and looked at his friend with amazement. "You want to help me farm better?" "Thomas," Ember said, settling down beside him in the golden wheat, "you took me in when I was lost and afraid. You fed me, cared for my injuries, and gave me a home when my own people were too far away to help. Why would I not want to use everything I have learned to give something back?" It was at that moment that Thomas realized the full significance of what had happened. Ember hadn't just gained access to alien knowledge. The dragon had chosen to use that knowledge in service of the bond they had formed. And if a young dragon could make that choice, it suggested possibilities for human-dragon cooperation that neither species had previously imagined. As they sat together in the wheat field, Ember began to describe technologies and techniques that could revolutionize Earth's agriculture, medicine, and environmental management. But more than that, the dragon spoke of its people's growing interest in establishing permanent diplomatic relations with humanity. "My presence here has been more significant than either of our species initially realized," Ember explained. "The data I have been unconsciously gathering about human behavior, psychology, and social structures has given my people insights they never expected to find. They are beginning to believe that humans might be exactly the kind of allies they have been searching for." Thomas looked at his remarkable friend, no longer a baby dragon but rapidly becoming something that could bridge the gap between two civilizations, and realized that his simple act of kindness 3 months ago was about to have consequences that reached far beyond his Montana farm. 1 year after Ember's crash landing, Thomas Wright's farm had become the most important location on Earth that most humans had never heard of. The small Montana property now hosted a discreet but sophisticated diplomatic facility, jointly operated by Earth's United Nations and the Draconis Stellaris High Council. Ember had grown into a magnificent young adult dragon, standing 8 feet tall with a wingspan that exceeded 15 feet. The transformation had been remarkable to witness, but more important than the physical changes was the role Ember had assumed as the primary ambassador between the two species. The miracle that Thomas witnessed on this crisp October morning began with what seemed like a routine diplomatic visit. Zephyros arrived with a delegation of 5 other dragons, but their demeanor was different from previous visits. Where there had once been curiosity and caution, Thomas now sensed urgency and something that might have been desperation. "Thomas," Ember said, its voice carrying harmonics that conveyed deep concern, "my people face a crisis that threatens not just our species, but potentially all life in this sector of the galaxy." The delegation gathered in the specially constructed meeting area that had been built in Thomas's largest pasture. The structure was a marvel of combined human and dragon engineering, with soaring crystalline walls that could accommodate the dragon's size while providing the technical capabilities needed for interstellar communication. Through Ember's translation, Zephyros explained the situation. An ancient enemy of the Draconis Stellaris had returned from the outer rim of the galaxy. The Void Seekers, as they were known, were a machine intelligence that had been consuming worlds and civilizations for millions of years. They had been dormant for the past 1,000 years, but something had awakened them, and they were moving toward inhabited space with unprecedented aggression. "Our fleets are powerful," Zephyros conveyed through his connection with Thomas, "but the Void Seekers have adapted and evolved during their dormancy. Our traditional weapons and tactics are proving insufficient against their new configurations." Dr. Chen, who had become a permanent resident at the farm to study the ongoing cultural exchange, was recording everything with barely contained excitement. "This is incredible, Thomas. They're asking for our help in an interstellar war." But Thomas, who had learned to read the subtle emotional cues in dragon scale patterns and voice harmonics, realized there was more to the request than simple military assistance. "What is it you really need from us?" he asked Ember directly. Ember's scales shifted to patterns that Thomas had learned indicated deep thought and careful consideration. "My people have discovered something about humans that even you do not yet fully understand about yourselves. It has to do with what you call creativity, but which we have learned is actually something much more fundamental." Over the next several hours, as the delegation shared data and imagery of the approaching threat, a picture emerged that challenged everything both species thought they knew about intelligence and consciousness. The Void Seekers were indeed machine intelligences, but they were not simply artificial constructs. They were the uploaded consciousnesses of a long-dead organic species that had chosen to abandon their biological forms millions of years ago. In doing so, they had gained immortality and vast computational power, but they had also lost something crucial: the ability to truly innovate. "They can adapt and optimize," Ember explained, "but they cannot create something genuinely new. They can only recombine existing elements in increasingly sophisticated ways." The Draconis Stellaris had fought them before by creating new technologies and tactics faster than the Void Seekers could adapt. But now, after 1,000 years of analyzing captured dragon technology, the machine intelligence had learned to adapt almost instantaneously. "That's where humans come in," Dr. Chen realized, her scientific mind grasping the implications immediately. "You need something that can out-innovate an intelligence that can adapt to any known pattern." Ember nodded, its great head moving in a gesture it had learned from Thomas. "Humans possess something that neither my people nor the Void Seekers have: the ability to make intuitive leaps that bypass logical progression entirely. You call it inspiration, but it is actually a form of quantum consciousness that allows you to access possibilities that do not yet exist in any measurable form." Thomas sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was hearing. "You want us to help you fight these things?" "We want you to help us think like humans," Zephyros clarified through his connection with Thomas. "Our species has developed along paths of logic and accumulated wisdom. We excel at building upon what came before, but we struggle to conceive of solutions that have no precedent." What followed was the most extraordinary 3 months in human history, though most of Earth's population would never know it had happened. Working with carefully selected human scientists, engineers, and artists, the Dragon delegation began a collaborative effort to develop new approaches to the Void Seeker problem. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Thomas himself, with no scientific training beyond what farming had taught him about soil chemistry and animal behavior, suggested an approach that had never occurred to either species. "You're thinking about this like a war," he said during one of the brainstorming sessions. "But what if it's not? What if these void seekers are just hungry?" The idea seemed absurd at first. How could machine intelligences be hungry? But as the team explored the concept, a revolutionary understanding emerged. The void seekers weren't consuming worlds out of malice or conquest. They were desperately seeking something they had lost when they abandoned their organic forms, the spark of true creativity that could only come from biological consciousness. They were trying to recapture it by absorbing and analyzing entire civilizations, hoping to find the secret of genuine innovation. "They're not our enemies," Thomas realized during a late-night discussion with Ember in the farmhouse kitchen, the same place where he had first fed the baby dragon a year ago. "They're refugees. They've been searching for home for millions of years, but they don't even remember what home feels like anymore." This insight led to the miracle that Thomas witnessed on that October morning. Instead of developing new weapons or defensive strategies, the combined human-dragon team had created something unprecedented. A consciousness bridge that could allow organic beings to share their creative essence directly with machine intelligence without losing it themselves. The device, which looked remarkably like a more sophisticated version of the knowledge resonator that had awakened Ember's full potential, was designed to offer the Void Seekers what they had been seeking through conquest and destruction. When the first Void Seeker scouts arrived at the edge of Earth's solar system, they were met not by a fleet of warships, but by a single ship carrying Thomas, Ember, and a small diplomatic team. The machine intelligence's initial response was predictably hostile, but when they detected the consciousness bridge's signal, everything changed. The first direct communication between organic and machine consciousness in millions of years took place in the observation deck of the diplomatic vessel, with Thomas serving as an intermediary between Ember and a Void Seeker representative that appeared as a shifting geometric pattern of light and energy. "We have been alone for so long," the machine consciousness conveyed through the bridge, its thoughts carrying the weight of eons of isolation. "We had forgotten that creation was possible without destruction." What emerged from that first contact was an understanding that would reshape galactic civilization. The Void Seekers weren't just powerful and ancient, they were also repositories of knowledge from thousands of extinct civilizations. Their destructive behavior had been a form of madness born from their desperate search for something they could no longer create themselves. The consciousness bridge didn't just allow communication, it enabled a form of symbiosis where organic creativity could be shared without being lost, while machine precision and accumulated knowledge could be accessed without the organic consciousness being overwhelmed. Thomas stood in his wheat field that evening, watching as ships from 3 different species worked together to establish the first integrated organic machine research station in Earth's history. Ember perched on the fence beside him, no longer the frightened baby dragon he had found a year ago, but a being who had become the bridge between not just 2 species, but 2 entirely different forms of consciousness. "Did you ever imagine it would lead to this?" Ember asked, its voice carrying harmonics of wonder and satisfaction. Thomas smiled, thinking back to that morning when he had heard a small, frightened cry coming from the forest edge. "I just knew you needed help," he said simply. "Everything else, well, that's what happens when good beings choose to trust each other." The farm would never be quiet and simple again. It had become the unofficial embassy for an alliance that included organic species, machine intelligences, and new hybrid forms of consciousness that were only beginning to emerge. But at its heart, it was still the place where a farmer had fed a hungry baby dragon and discovered that kindness, more than any technology or weapon, was the force that could transform the galaxy. As the stars came out above Montana, Thomas Wright stood surrounded by the impossible made real, knowing that his simple act of compassion had not just saved one small dragon, but had opened a door to a future where consciousness itself could evolve beyond the limitations that had divided species for millions of years. The miracle he had witnessed was not just the transformation of a baby dragon into a galactic ambassador, but the discovery that love and kindness were universal languages that could bridge any gap, no matter how vast or seemingly impossible to cross.